Morning, everybody. I'll make it around about 11:30. So I think we're ready to go. Welcome to this webinar on share schemes for private companies. Just a word of warning, there appears to be some building work going on quite near where I'm sitting. So I apologise in advance for any odd noises you might hear. It's not me. This webinar is going to last for around about 30 minutes, after which you can ask questions online, assuming I can work the technology. If I can't work the technology, you can always call me afterwards or email me on the details below with any questions. My name's Sarah Anderson. I'm a share scheme solicitor. I have been working in the practice of share schemes for around about 20 years, focusing almost entirely on share plans for private companies. So that's me. The webinar itself today, I'm going to be focusing on a practical outline introduction rather than a technical seminar. I'll be talking about why you might want to introduce a share scheme in the first place, some design considerations you might want to take into account, and a brief summary of the key schemes that are available. And I'll also run through some real life scenarios which are based on examples that we've had with our clients, which I hope will be useful. So to begin with, those of you who are TED Talk aficionados, you may have come across Simon Sinek. I am going to blatantly use his theory of start with why to begin this presentation. The outline argument is you always begin with why before moving on to how, and last of all, what. So not everybody might agree with that approach, but it does match with the approach we normally take in respect to share plans. So if we translate that into the world of share plans, you can usually break down those sections as follows. Why do we want to put in place a share plan? Typically, the answer is to get engaged, incentivized employees, but there's often more to it than that. How are we going to do it? By establishing a share plan that delivers appropriate rewards for the employees. And finally, what plan are we going to use? And there's a whole collection of plans sitting around the outside edge, which I'll talk about later. But very often we're actually contacted by prospective clients who already have the what, or think that they've got, meaning the type of share scheme they want to implement. And that's usually because they've worked somewhere previously and benefited from a particular type of scheme, or they've heard about significant tax advantages that might attach to a share plan. Very often they've got the what part right, but sometimes it's not the right scheme for them because they haven't looked at the why part first, and they haven't looked at the how. So in share schemes, to begin with the why, the answer is, as I've said, we want engaged, incentivized employees. Well, who wouldn't want engaged, incentivized employees? You sometimes want to ask a few more questions here. So why do you want them engaged and incentivized? Do you want them working towards particular objectives, such as a corporate sale, or to increase profitability within the company, or even within one division? Are you looking at short-term objectives or long-term ones, or a mixture? And who do you want to be engaged, especially? Everybody, or just key employees, or everybody in the company, but at a slightly different level? And remember that the why bit doesn't just involve employees. You also need to take into account various other interests, for example, existing shareholders and the company. You'll need to be happy in particular that the existing shareholders are okay with giving away some of their equity, and that they're happy that the overall growth in the company, hopefully produced by the share plan, is commensurate with the dilution they're going to face. So broadly, you need to make sure that the interests of the shareholders and the employee participants are aligned. And the company itself should see some benefits from the implementation of the plan. Your corporate objectives should form part of the focus of any plan you put in place. Realisation of reward by employees should be subject to the achievement of required corporate targets, whether that's growth in one particular division or perhaps the sale of the company as a whole. The next bit is the how. How is your share plan going to achieve your objectives and work for you? And that's all really down to design considerations. So, for example, what's your ultimate goal, or the goal of the other shareholders? Are you perhaps looking to sell the company? If so, when and to whom? Is the sale part of succession planning, or is it part of a series of entrepreneurial ventures? Is it going to be an all or nothing arrangement, or is there maybe just one key shareholder looking to take a step back while still retaining an interest in the business? Maybe there'll be a partial sale to an investor. Maybe you're looking to enter into other business arrangements like joint ventures or mergers. You need to think about how your share plan is going to get you to that point, and also whether having employee shareholders might impact on your ability to achieve certain objectives. And when it comes to the plan itself, how is it going to look? Is it for everybody or for the selected few? At what point do you want people to actually have rights to acquire shares? Straight away or after a certain time or dependent on performance conditions? Are you looking for people to get share-based rewards because they've been loyal to you in the past? Or is the reward going to be completely dependent on future performance? You'll need to think about whether you're thinking about shares or options. So, of course, a share gives the employee shareholder the rights of a shareholder, such as votes or dividends, although you can use different types of shares without voting rights in a private company if you wish to do that. Whereas, unlike a share, an option is just a promise to acquire shares in the future at a price fixed today. And you decide when the time is right for employees to become actual shareholders, maybe after 3 years to test their loyalty, or when the company's doubled in value to test performance, or maybe it's only when the company's sold, if that's your one overriding objective. And you'll probably need to think about various other detailed points as well. So how much do you want to give away? How much dilution are you comfortable? Do you want employees to be able to buy and sell shares in the company? What happens if they leave? How long do you think the scheme is going to last for? And how often do you think you're going to make awards? When you've been through that how section, you're now in a much better position to look at the what's. So these are the schemes that you can, or the main schemes that you can choose to use as a private company. In some cases, just one will do the job fine. In other situations, depending on your whys and your hows, you might end up having to use more than one arrangement to meet your objectives. So, for example, some of the tax advantage share schemes can't be used for non-employees, and I'll look at some examples of those later. You can divide the schemes up into various boxes. I've chosen 3 subsectors here. Plans where you grant options over shares, plans where you let employees buy shares, and plans where you gift shares to employees, i.e. they don't pay anything for the shares that they acquire. So looking at the options box first, as I've noted previously, an option is just a promise to buy shares in the future at a price that's fixed today. Options don't give shareholders any rights until the participants exercise their option and bought the shares. The price at which they buy the shares and the timing is generally fixed at the outset, and there can be some flexibility on the timing and price depending on what type of plan you use. So Enterprise Management Incentive, or EMI, is the plan we put in place most often. It's very flexible, very tax efficient. You can grant options under EMI over different classes of shares. You can attach any performance conditions you want, so ranging from the very simple options exercisable only on the sale of a business, right through to time-based and performance-based vesting. You can also choose the exercise price at which options are granted, although there will be a tax charge on exercise if the exercise price is less than the market value of the shares at the date of grant. But taking that into account, the default tax treatment for EMI is that there's no tax on exercise of the option, and when the shares are eventually sold, all gains are subject to capital gains tax rather than income tax and potential national insurance contributions. Also, participants should benefit from entrepreneurs' relief, which provides an ultimate tax rate of only 10%. And that's even if the participants hold less than 5% of the company's share capital, which is the usual requirement to get entrepreneurs' relief. So you can see why we recommend EMI for companies that qualify broadly, smaller independent companies with fewer than 250 employees. The Company Share Option Plan, or CSOP, is the next most tax efficient option plan. It doesn't have the same tax advantages as EMI, so it doesn't give entrepreneurs relief, and the limits are lower, £30,000 worth of options every 3 years per participant, rather than the £250,000 for EMI. And it's not as flexible. So, for example, you wouldn't usually be able to create a different class of, say, non-voting shares for CSOP like you could for EMI. But if your company's too big for EMI, or if it carries out a certain type of trade, like financial services, CSOP may well be the next best thing. So CSOP and EMI are both aimed at employees, and they can usually only be used in the top companies in a group. For non-employees or for subsidiary companies, you can't grant tax-advantaged options. You could use a non-tax advantaged share option plan, also known as unapproved share options, which would mirror the effect of the EMI or the CSOP, but all the gains there will be subject to income tax and potentially national insurance rather than capital gains tax. And finally, you could use a phantom share option plan, That's really not anything more than a cash-based plan with a payout based on the increase in share value. So it's very flexible, but it's not very tax efficient, and it also requires you to have a decent idea about your share value, which, in my opinion, makes it not much more than a complicated bonus plan. But sometimes a bonus plan will meet your requirements. So there it is as an alternative for you. Just as a note, you'll probably have heard of ShareSave, SAYE, Save As You Earn, which is an all-employee tax advantage share option plan. I've not covered this plan in this webinar because it's really only appropriate for much bigger listed companies. Moving on to the next box, which is talking about buying shares. If you want participants to benefit from direct shareholdings in your company, it might be appropriate to ask them to make a financial commitment at some level. So a plan that we sometimes use, which has the advantage that it can be used not just for employees, but also for non-employees or consultants, is the deferred share purchase plan. So this involves participants committing to pay the current market value of the shares, but the payment's deferred until a later date and left outstanding as a loan from the company. Excuse me. So this arrangement's got a number of advantages. Firstly, you can offer it to non-employees as well as employees. It allows payments for the shares to be made at a time when the participants actually have the money. So, for example, they could pay off their loan out of dividends paid on the shares or from the proceeds of a sale. The participants become shareholders immediately, which means they can benefit from the shareholder rights, such as the dividend payment. And future gains beyond that market value that they promised to pay are subject to capital gains tax rather than income tax, which would be the situation if you used a non-tax advantaged share option scheme. The big downside for the deferred share purchase plan is that it's a financial risk. If the value of the shares goes down, the participants are generally still on the hook for the amount owing. So it's not a scheme we recommend for anyone other than more senior employees or consultants. An alternative might be the use of growth shares. That's a more complicated arrangement. It usually involves amending your articles to create a new class of shares, which will only attain any value once the companies hit certain hurdles. So, for example, the share values increase beyond a certain predefined level. So the theory is that until those hurdles are reached, the shares have very little value. So the employees pay very little when they acquire the shares to begin with. And again, like other shareholders, on the sale, they would be subject to capital gains tax on the gains made. You can also use growth shares inside an EMI wrapper, actually, so the participants can benefit from entrepreneurs' relief. The downside of growth shares is that the drafting of the share rights can be complicated and thus expensive. And the other downside is that while at the moment this type of scheme seems to be accepted by HMRC, there's no guarantee, given current views on tax avoidance, that they won't review the plans in the future. The accepted view in the marketplace is that these arrangements are entirely valid and aren't being challenged, but never say never. Another point is that of late, HMRC's share valuation department has become significantly more bullish in relation to the valuation of shares for employee share schemes, including growth share plans, and including just EMI schemes. Their approach is currently not particularly consistent, but there have been companies who have approached HMRC for a low valuation for EMI options or growth shares and have got a surprisingly negative kickback, whereas in the past you might have been able to agree a pretty low value for those shares. So that's an ongoing situation which we are monitoring. You can't assume that you will definitively get nominal valuation for growth shares at the moment. And then finally in the purchase box, there's the government recognised tax advantage plan called the Share Incentive Plan, or SIP, and that allows employees to purchase shares out of pre-tax salary. This is the only share plan with government blessing that covers the purchase of shares. It's an extremely tax efficient plan. It provides the opportunity for employees to receive and sell shares in their employee completely tax-free. And the SIP straddles both the purchase and the gift columns because it also enables a company to gift shares to its employees without them paying a penny for the shares and also without paying any tax or national insurance contributions on that gift. So the SIP can be used in a number of ways. Employees can be given up to £3,600 worth of free shares each year. They can buy up to £1,800 worth of shares out of pre-tax salary, partnership shares, each year. And for each partnership share they can buy, they can be gifted a further 2 free shares, known as matching shares, again without any tax arising. So employees can receive up to £9,000 worth of shares in their employing company, but only pay a very small fraction of that amount and not be taxed on it. Of course, the government's only going to give away those kind of tax breaks if you jump through some hoops. So SIPP has to be made available to all employees on a broadly similar basis, so fairly, equitably. So that's not for every company. Not everybody wants to do that. The other point is that the full tax breaks are only available if the shares have been held for the employees in a trust for a minimum of 5 years. That's quite a long time. Not everybody might have that amount of time for their share plan to come to fruition. And the plan also requires a separate trust. So what with the trust and the long-term nature of the plan and the very flexible offerings available under it, SIPP's not a particularly cheap plan, and it's not one that's particularly easy to administer. But if you are looking to reward all of your employees, and especially if you're looking for something a little bit like the John Lewis Partnership, SIPP can really be an excellent solution. And then even more of a John Lewis solution is the relatively new Employee Ownership Trust. This is a trust that has a controlling interest in a company, more than 50%, which is held on behalf of all of the employees. It doesn't involve individual share ownership, but it is perfectly possible to run other tax advantage schemes alongside it, like EMI. So employees, including key employees, can retain a larger interest in the business directly. So EOT's particular tax advantage for employees is that an EOT-controlled company can pay bonuses up to £3,600 per annum to each employee without any income tax charge arising. And the big tax break for EOTs is for selling shareholders. Individuals who transfer a controlling interest in a company into an EOT will pay no capital gains tax on such a transfer. So for retiring shareholders, especially those wishing to keep the existing company running sustainably and for the long term, the EOT can be a very attractive alternative to the more traditional trade sale or voluntary liquidation. So that's all pretty theoretical stuff. I thought it might be helpful to look at a couple of real-life examples of people who've put in place share plans and the plans they've chosen and why. Let's start with a startup. So this is Nicola and Vicky. That's a new restaurant chain, 3 restaurants so far, anticipating rapid growth. They've got some outside investment. They want to sell in about 5 years. They want everybody to work towards the ultimate goal of a sale and reap the benefit. Typically for a startup, they're cash strapped. They need to hire a new and good FD to get their business in shape, but they don't really have a lot of money to pay. And they also have an NED who's happy to act as a mentor for a minimum payment, providing some equity is offered. That's why they want a share scheme. How are they going to set about it? Well, they only want employees to benefit if they sell the company. Nicola and Vicky aren't going to benefit themselves, so that seems only fair. As majority shareholders, also, they've already given up some equity for their investors, and they're keen not to dilute control further. So using options that are exercisable only if the company is sold is probably the best approach. They want to differentiate between the finance director and the other staff. The FD is obviously the most important, but the chefs are important as well, and they want their front of house and admin staff to be involved as well. So as they're growing, they might want to think about some equity modelling to make sure that the equity pool is sufficient for new joiners and to work out the right percentage for the FD in particular. And they'll also want to take into account levers, because the restaurant business does tend to have a fairly rapid turnaround. That needs to be taken into account as well. And they'll need to think about lever provisions in their plan when they're looking at that. The non-exec director is not an employee. He won't be able to benefit from a tax advantage employee share scheme. So they'll need to think of something different for him. Ideally, something that means he's paying capital gains tax rather than income tax, because I've yet to come across a non-exec director who is happy to pay income tax on his shares. He always wants capital gains tax treatment. So they need to think about him separately. And finally, they need to take into account their investors' views. The investors don't have a majority stake, but they do need to be on board with any plan. So especially as regards dilution. So they need to think about them as well. So what are they going to do? An EMI option plan with options exercisable only on an exit is probably ideal for this company. It's still small and growing. The plan's discretionary, so they can differentiate between the staff, including the FD even. They can include part-timers, as long as those employees spend the majority of their working time with the company. They can have the rules drafted so that options lapse if people leave for any reason whatsoever. But they could treat the FD differently if they want to, and allow him to retain some options after leaving if they think he's performed appropriately. They can draft different conditions in his option agreement from everybody else if they want to do that. As regards valuation, it should be possible to agree a low valuation with HMRC to maximise the EMI rewards. So the lower the price, the higher the potential gain to participants, and the smaller percentage of equity that needs to be used in the plan to provide a reward for the employees. But you do need to be careful if investors have put investment into the company at a higher rate. As I mentioned earlier, in the past, we've had plenty of success agreeing a low valuation in a startup company that's effectively not making any money yet. Investors may have put in some money as hope value. But at the moment, HMRC's view is a little bit flexible, so we can't always guarantee that. You would usually hope that a company at a startup stage and making losses would be able to be valued at a different price from what the investors were slinging money into the company to be used for working capital. And that's certainly the argument we would use, though whether or not it's always going to work these days is questionable. For the non-exec director, can't get EMI. Even if he was an employee, he's probably working for other businesses, so he probably won't qualify. So for him, the DSPP arrangement won't work. So he subscribes for shares directly, only pays a small amount up front, with the rest left outstanding as a loan. And he can pay that when he's got the readies, maybe when the company sells value. That should deliver the capital gains tax treatments he will doubtless want. If he's an NED, the fact that the company, the plan covers something of a financial risk, he should be able to cover it, or he should be prepared to take that in order to get the capital gains tax treatment. If he doesn't want to take any risk, he can have a non-tax advantage share option, and the tax treatment will be different for that. So that's how I deal with that startup business. Let's look at a slightly more mature business. Company at a different stage of the life cycle. So Kevin's been building a successful, profitable business for 20 years. He's got a really good management team. He's starting to think about a sale of the business before he gets too old to sail around the world. So ideally in the next 3 or 5 years. He'd like to reward his managers on 2 levels. Firstly, on an ongoing basis now to tie them into the company, and with an additional reward if they can help him achieve the sale that he needs to buy his big yacht. How's he going to do that? So, well, he needs to work out exactly who he needs to reward in the team and at what level. He might want to think about if there are other people who sit below the management team who could also benefit. He probably needs to build a team's commitment with an intermediate financial reward, perhaps fit out at intervals. At the same time, he needs to get them to focus on the ultimate aim, which is the sale, with a promise of the stake in the sale proceeds. Perhaps he'd like to ensure that the reward only arises to a certain amount if he achieves an appropriate exit at a certain value. So what's he going to do? EMI was originally designed for smaller, fast-growing businesses, but in fact it's still suitable for perfectly decent-sized private companies. As long as Kevin's company doesn't employ 250 or more full-time employees and it's got gross assets of less than £30 million, it's still of a size that can meet the EMI criteria. And because EMI is so flexible and so tax efficient, the rule of thumb is if you can use it, then do so. So here, Kevin could put in place an EMI scheme with a mix of exercise provisions, some relating to immediate or intermediate exercise, and some linked to exercise on exit. The intermediate exercise could be time-based vesting or depending on performance conditions, maybe with options becoming exercisable every year, allowing participants to acquire shares as time goes by. And for particularly key individuals, Kevin could allow some options to become exercisable immediately to reward them for past service and to demonstrate his commitment to them. Of course, in order to exercise the options and acquire the shares, the participants will need to pay the exercise price. That's not, in my view, a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with asking individuals to make some kind of financial commitment to become a shareholder. It means they've got a skin in the game. And given that the company is mature and profitable, there is likely to be some value in it. It is usually possible to agree a discounted value with HMRC for the private company shares like these. So the exercise price should typically be a lot lower than what the company shares would fetch if they were sold to an acquirer in a sales situation 3 to 4 or 5 years' time. Alternatively, you could set the exercise price for these EMI options with a nominal value exercise price, a penny per share or whatever. The impact of that is that the participants would be subject on exercise to income tax on the discount to market value, but it's still a method of acquiring shares at a much lower price than what you might call the real commercial value. And if Kevin really wanted to be generous, he could pay them a bonus to cover off the exercise price so the participants aren't out of pocket. The shares they acquire could pay dividends, so once options have been exercised, there's a possibility of an ongoing financial reward, still slightly more tax efficient than a tax bonus. The shares could be non-voting to protect Kevin's position as our ultimate controller of the business, although there is, of course, an argument that giving the managers votes might give them a bigger stake in the business and make them really feel like owners if that's what Kevin wants to achieve. With regard to the options that are exercisable only on exit, that could just simply be if an exit happens, you exercise, or it could be tied to a certain value. So 100 options become exercisable on a sale, but if you get a sale for consideration of more than £12 million, maybe you get 150 options becoming exercisable at that point. So this kind of scheme, particularly if you're talking about people being able to acquire shares, Kevin needs to give a little bit more thought to particularly his article of association. Once somebody's become a shareholder, what happens then if they cease employment afterwards? You need to have leaver provisions in the articles. He needs to be able to get those shares back from ex-employees. Perhaps needs to make sure that if that sale does come into view, he has drag and tag provisions in his articles to make sure that a minority shareholder can't get in the way of him agreeing a sale to his acquirer. Modelling and valuation, I think here would be quite important to ensure suitable levels of reward for key staff and other staff. And with a scheme like this, when you've got regular exercise going on, potentially not necessarily complicated, but performance conditions, people potentially buying and selling shares, exercising options lapsing, you do need to make sure you've got good admin and record keeping, because when the sale comes into view, the first thing your acquirer will do will look back at all the records and ask annoying questions like, did you get the shares valued with HMRC? Have you done your returns properly? Who's getting what? They want to know all those details. So it's good administration is really key for a business like this, especially if you're really looking for a sale at the end of the period. I'm just going to talk really quickly about succession. This is a big question, obviously. I'm not going to advise on how somebody should necessarily plan their succession in the business, but there's sometimes employee share schemes can help. So we've got a firm of architects, traditional partnership structure, although they're incorporated. Some partners are looking to retire, but they want to retain an interest and keep the business going. Lots and lots of architects are very interested in this particular route. They want to transfer their business to their current employees, but perhaps with key managers getting a bigger percentage. That's why they want to do it. They want to keep the business going. They want a bit of an exit for themselves as well. So again, you've got how questions. Is everybody joining in, or is it just key employees? If you're doing key employees, what kind of level of reward are you giving? How much of an interest are the existing owners going to retain? If they want to sell their shares, which they do, obviously, how much do they want to get for them? What value are they placing on the company? And you need to think about the time period when people are going to retire, exactly at what point is the new management team going to be ready to take over the business. So there's quite big questions there. As I say, it's not necessarily, obviously it's not a straightforward answer, and a share scheme is not going to provide all the answers for people with succession issues. But one approach might be the employee ownership trust that I mentioned. So if the existing owners transfer a controlling interest to the EOT, they needn't sell all their shares. As long as it's 51%, that's fine. As long as they've transferred that controlling interest, they won't pay any capital gains tax on that transfer. They could retain some of their shares. They'll need to get the company valued, obviously, to make sure the trust isn't paying above market value. But once that trust is in place, it holds the shares on behalf of the employees, maybe 51%, maybe 75%, with the ex-partners still maintaining an interest of, say, 25% between them. Once you've got that EOT controlled businesses, you've got the ability for the company to pay the tax-free bonuses, £3,600 per annum to each employee without any income tax. This is sometimes described as a John Lewis model. If companies have got a real interest in transferring the business into the hands of their employees, rather than looking for an external buyer, this is a really good way of doing it. And there are increasing numbers of businesses taking this route. So, for example, Aardman Animations, the Wallace and Gromit people, and more recently Richer Sounds transferred to an EOT. If you're not quite ready for the full EOT, there are other flexible approaches. So, for example, using a share incentive plan, again, an all-employee plan, more direct form of share ownership. No need for the SIP to acquire a controlling interest, but the partners can transfer their own shares into the SIP for award to employees. And then you've got the ability for employees to buy shares or be given free shares, depending on how much financial commitment they're required to make. And if you have an EOT, actually, there is no reason why you can't run other share schemes alongside it. So you can have top-up EMI options for senior managers, or you could even have a SIP to provide direct share ownership for all employees in the business alongside the EOT, which provides that kind of protective, controlling interest in the business. So that's a really quick run through Succession. I mean, EOT is proving very, very popular with businesses looking for a succession solution and with an interest in employee ownership and long-term sustainability. So definitely worth looking at if that is something you are considering. I make it around midday, so I think it's nearly time to wind up. I just wanted to say 3 things to take away. If you take 3 things from this webinar, look at why first. Always identify your objectives. Otherwise, you end up spending time and money on a share scheme that doesn't work for the employees or the company or the owners. Just work out what you want them to do, and then you can work through the how and the what. Please try and keep it simple. Don't try and make your share scheme do the work of a bonus plan and a pension plan all at the same time. It's not going to work. Nobody understands it. Ends up being really complicated and expensive. So I spend a lot of my time telling to people to keep it as simple as possible. And then finally, don't let the tax tail wag the commercial dog. For example, SIP carries brilliant tax benefits. You can achieve 0% tax rates for your employees. No income tax, no national insurance contributions, no capital gains tax if it works right. But if you are putting in a SIP purely for those reasons, and then you start trying to twist it because you don't really want people in the operations team to benefit or something like that, it's simply not going to work. You need to look at the concept behind the scheme and what you want to do. These schemes carry tax advantages, but that is not the main purpose of putting them in. So that's the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it helpful. I'm just going to have a quick look and see if there's any questions. Will you send out a copy of the slides? A copy of the slides will be available on our website. And there's also the YouTube channel, which this webinar should go on. But if Tom, if you send me your email address, I can send you a copy as well if you want to do that. I don't see any other questions. As I say, you can ask me after the webinar if something crops up. There's my email address. There's my telephone number. I'm always really very, very happy to speak to anybody about share schemes. So thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. Bye.